He called himself a constitutional expert. She called his bluff, live, in front of the entire country. What began as a routine hearing exploded into a public legal reckoning. The speaker froze. The room fell silent. And when she dropped her final line, even his own party couldn't defend him. So, what did she say? Before we get to this explosive moment, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth still matters, hit subscribe. We've got another jaw-dropping story coming tomorrow. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of the hearing room, a thick folder spread open in front of her. Her voice was steady, deliberate, every word chosen with precision. The fluorescent lights above seemed to sharpen the intensity of the moment, casting an almost theatrical glow over the confrontation unfolding in real time. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "That's not constitutional law, Mr. Speaker," she said, flipping to a bookmarked page and holding it up for the room to see. "That's constitutional malpractice." Across the room, Mike Johnson sat motionless for a beat too long. His expression, usually so confident and composed, flickered with something unfamiliar. Uncertainty. Aide whispers started in the background. Republican committee members exchanged glances. Even the camera crew, trained to keep steady, shifted slightly, sensing something seismic was underway. Johnson leaned forward, his hands clasped, searching for footing. "I believe," he began. But Crockett cut him off. "You said you wanted to educate me," she said calmly, never raising her tone. "I suggest you take notes." The air in the hearing room thinned. The silence wasn't empty. It was electric. No one spoke. No one even moved. The Speaker of the House, once the undisputed legal authority in the chamber, now stared across the table at a first-term Congresswoman dismantling his arguments, brick by brick, case by case, and for the first time in his career, Mike Johnson had nothing to say. What was supposed to be a routine oversight hearing on emergency powers had turned into something else entirely, a moment of reckoning. Not just for Johnson, but for anyone who thought courtroom experience couldn't rival political power. This wasn't a disagreement, it was a collapse, and the cameras were rolling the entire time. Mike Johnson didn't rise to power by accident. He was methodical, articulate, and deeply aware of the value of his legal background. Long before he became Speaker of the House, Johnson had crafted a political identity rooted in one core principle: constitutional authority. He wasn't just another politician reciting talking points. He was the GOP's legal anchor, the man who, in every hearing and media appearance, found a way to quote the framers, cite landmark Supreme Court rulings, and remind his audience that he didn't just believe in the Constitution, he lived it. Born and raised in Louisiana, Johnson built his career through conservative legal circles. He worked for the Alliance Defending Freedom, arguing religious liberty cases and crafting constitutional briefs that were circulated throughout Republican think tanks. Colleagues often introduced him as the party's constitutional compass. He had written multiple amicus briefs, lectured at legal conferences, and led internal GOP strategy sessions on constitutional interpretation. By the time he was elected Speaker, he had become synonymous with constitutional literacy, at least in Republican circles. When the border crisis intensified and national attention turned to executive authority, Johnson saw an opportunity. He proposed a sweeping emergency powers bill that would expand congressional authority over border enforcement, framing it as a necessary response to federal inaction. To his base, it was bold leadership. To legal scholars, it was deeply troubling. Still, Johnson pressed forward. He wasn't worried. He believed his legal citations were airtight and that his reputation would shield him from serious challenge. What he didn't count on, what none of them counted on, was Jasmine Crockett. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett was not supposed to be a threat. At least, that's what her opponents assumed. A freshman Democrat from Texas, she had the resume of a legal pit bull and the public profile of a rookie. But behind that quiet demeanor was a courtroom warrior with a record that spoke louder than any headline. Crockett earned her law degree from the University of Houston Law Center, where she served as editor of the Houston Law Review. From there, she built a legal career focused on civil rights, defending some of the most difficult constitutional cases in federal court. As a public defender, she handled Fourth Amendment violations, due process disputes, and equal protection challenges, all the raw material of real constitutional law, argued not from a podium but from the trenches. She had argued before the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. She'd never lost a constitutional motion in federal court. While Johnson was making cable news appearances and crafting rhetorical flourishes, Crockett was studying precedents, preparing litigation, and winning in the very legal arenas that Johnson claimed to understand. But in the halls of Congress, she was underestimated. Most saw her as a junior member, too new to carry weight, too quiet to pose a challenge. They were wrong. When Johnson's emergency powers bill was introduced, Crockett didn't attack it publicly. She didn't issue dramatic press statements or seek airtime. Instead, she studied. For weeks, she dissected every page of the legislation. She read the cases Johnson cited. She examined the constitutional theories behind his argument. And when she found the holes, she built a case, not in the political sense, but in the legal one. She cross-referenced Supreme Court rulings. She pored over concurring and dissenting opinions. She created a full legal map of the flaws in Johnson's framework. While others were strategizing optics, Crockett was preparing for cross-examination. Her silence wasn't a sign of submission. It was the sound of a seasoned litigator sharpening the knife. By the time the hearing began, the room was stacked in Johnson's favor. He had the gavel, he had the majority, he had the narrative, but Crockett had something more dangerous. She had the truth, and she had the receipts to prove it. The confrontation was never going to be a random accident. It was an ambush, but a legal one. Johnson walked in expecting dominance. Crockett walked in knowing exactly when and how to strike. The stakes were massive. For Johnson, it was another opportunity to affirm his legacy as a constitutional voice within his party. For Crockett, it was a moment to expose how thin that legacy really was. Their collision didn't just test political ideology, it tested intellectual integrity. It tested whether power alone can carry an argument or whether substance can still win. The audience watching, both in the room and across America, didn't just witness two people arguing. They witnessed two worldviews colliding, one built on performance, the other on preparation. The arrogance Johnson carried into that hearing wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It reflected the assumption that prestige outranks precision, that power trumps principle. But Crockett's calm dismantling of his arguments didn't just challenge his authority, it rewrote the rules of the room. In that moment, everything shifted, and the country watched a political myth begin to unravel under the weight of real constitutional expertise. The hearing room buzzed with a familiar rhythm, one that Speaker Mike Johnson had grown comfortable with over years of power and prestige. He sat tall behind the elevated dais, flanked by loyal Republican allies and stacks of annotated documents. From his body language alone, it was clear he felt at ease. This was his home turf. The chamber, the cameras, the Constitution. He believed he had mastered them all. The session began with predictable choreography. Republican colleagues took turns teeing up softball questions designed to showcase Johnson's grasp of constitutional law. One leaned forward and asked, "Mr. Speaker, could you walk us through how this emergency powers bill protects national sovereignty?" Johnson smiled, appreciative of the setup. "Absolutely," he began, his voice projecting across the room. "We are in the midst of a constitutional crisis, one where the federal executive branch has failed to protect our borders. This bill restores congressional authority in a manner fully consistent with both the text and spirit of the Constitution." He launched into citations, familiar ones, impressive on the surface. Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer, Ex parte Milligan, Korematsu v. United States, each referenced with confidence, layered with historical flourish. To the untrained ear, it sounded unshakable. Even some Democrats in the room looked momentarily boxed in by the authority of his delivery. But Jasmine Crockett was not untrained. She sat toward the end of the committee bench, her posture relaxed but focused. She scribbled quietly in a yellow legal pad, rarely glancing up. Her face didn't show defiance or frustration, just patience and precision. As Johnson continued to speak, something in her body language began to shift. Her eyes narrowed when he misquoted Youngstown. Her pen stopped when he referenced Milligan incorrectly. When he twisted the meaning of Korematsu to justify expanded powers, she tapped her folder twice and underlined something. Nobody else noticed, but Crockett had seen everything she needed to see. The chairman called on her next. A subtle hush fell over the room. This wasn't her first time speaking, but something about her stillness, her unhurried rise from her seat, made everyone pause. She didn't look at her colleagues. She looked straight at Johnson. "Mr. Speaker," she began, voice calm, deliberate, nearly flat in tone. "With all due respect, I'm a little confused how a man of your legal stature could misunderstand the very cases you've been citing." Johnson blinked. The air thinned. Even the Republican members stopped flipping through their notes. "If the gentle lady from Texas would allow me to clarify," Johnson offered, already trying to regain control of the exchange. "Oh, no, sir," she replied, her tone now tinged with steel. You said you wanted to educate me. Let's begin. She reached into her folder and pulled out a stack of printed opinions. Let's start with Youngstown, she said, placing the Supreme Court's majority opinion on the table beside her. You referenced this case as support for your emergency powers bill, but you either didn't read it or didn't understand it. She read aloud from Justice Jackson's concurrence. When the president acts contrary to the express or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb. She paused and looked up. Your bill does exactly that. It overrides constitutional limits by granting unilateral enforcement powers to Congress in contradiction of executive authority. That's the very kind of action this case prohibits. Johnson opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Crockett continued. You also referenced Ex parte Milligan, she said, pulling that decision out next. You used it to justify suspending certain constitutional safeguards during emergencies. But this case says, quote, the Constitution of the United States is a law for rulers and people equally in war and in peace. She held the document up for emphasis. It literally affirms that the Constitution cannot be suspended, even during crisis. And you used it to argue the exact opposite. The room tensed. Johnson adjusted his tie and sat back slightly. His colleagues began to fidget. The buzz that had once filled the room now turned into a collective silence. And Korematsu, she added, raising a single eyebrow. You used it to justify granting sweeping authority during national emergencies. You failed to mention that it was explicitly denounced by the Supreme Court in Trump versus Hawaii and widely considered a historical stain on constitutional jurisprudence. She shook her head. You cherry-picked one of the most shameful precedents in American legal history and used it as justification for a bill you claim protects constitutional order. Johnson reached for his notes, flipping pages. His fingers trembled slightly. This isn't interpretation, Crockett said sharply. This is misrepresentation. You're citing cases that contradict your own conclusions, and you're doing it under the pretense of legal authority. The hearing room transformed from a space of debate into something closer to a courtroom. Crockett wasn't grandstanding. She wasn't performing. She was litigating. Each sentence built upon the last, forming a wall of logic that left no room for retreat. Johnson tried again. These are complex issues. There are multiple schools of thought. And none of the ones you cited support your argument, she interrupted. Your position is legally indefensible. She leaned forward now, her voice slow, precise. You're not just wrong, Mr. Speaker. You're dangerously wrong. She tapped the folder once more. This document contains a line-by-line refutation of every legal claim you made today, including your misuse of precedent, your omission of key holdings, and your distortion of constitutional principles. Johnson was silent. His staff exchanged nervous glances. One of his aides leaned in to whisper something, but Johnson waved him off. I'm sure you remember what you said earlier today, Crockett continued. You told me you'd be happy to educate me. She paused, letting the silence settle in the room. Well, class is now in session. Crockett flipped to another page. This isn't about politics. It's about power, and the limits placed on it by our Constitution. The very document you swore to uphold. Your bill violates the separation of powers, ignores judicial precedent, and undermines the very legal foundations you claim to defend. She set the final document down. And either you know that, or you don't. Her words hung in the air. There was no escape hatch, no sound bite that could fix this moment. Johnson tried one last time. Congresswoman, I suggest we move on to more productive lines of questioning. Crockett cut him off again. We're not moving on, Mr. Speaker. The American people deserve to know why their elected leaders are using the Constitution as a prop instead of the rule of law. She stepped away from the microphone but didn't leave the podium. She simply stood there, eyes fixed on Johnson, as he sat in a silence so complete it was deafening. His face told the story: anger, confusion, and the quiet collapse of a reputation built on rhetorical smoke. The Speaker of the House had been called to account, not by a rival, not by a partisan attack, but by someone who knew the law better than he did, and wasn't afraid to prove it. Jasmine Crockett didn't reach for the microphone. She didn't adjust her tone. She didn't need to. Her authority came not from volume, but from clarity. In her hand was a thick folder, tabbed, highlighted, annotated in her own handwriting. It wasn't a prop. It was a weapon. Let's be clear, she said, lifting the folder slightly for the cameras to catch. The Constitution exists to limit power, not justify its expansion. That line hit like a drumbeat. No applause, no gasps, just a collective straightening of backs, a sharpening of attention. Across the room, Republican aides leaned toward one another, whispering quickly. Staffers from both parties stopped taking notes and started watching. The few reporters allowed in the hearing room suddenly raised their cameras. Mike Johnson blinked. Crockett turned to the first tabbed page. You've cited Youngstown sheet and tube Covey Sawyer 3 times today to justify this bill. But you've either misunderstood the ruling or hoped no one else here actually read it. She began reading aloud. Justice Jackson's concurrence, the landmark framework outlining presidential power in times of emergency. Her tone was measured, slow, deliberately accessible. Not for Johnson, for the American people. Justice Jackson wrote, "When the president takes measures incompatible with the expressed or implied will of Congress, his power is at its lowest ebb." She looked up, locked eyes with Johnson. "You're proposing a bill that gives emergency powers in defiance of established congressional limits. That's not just a legal misstep. It's a direct contradiction of this very framework." Johnson attempted to interject, raising a hand as if to reclaim control of the room. But Crockett was already moving on. She flipped to the next case. "You then cited ex parte Milligan as support for suspending certain protections during national crises. Mr. Speaker, Milligan says the exact opposite. It states, and I quote, 'The Constitution of the United States is a law for rulers and people, equally in war and in peace.'" Now even some of the Republican members began shifting in their seats. "You're using a case that affirms constitutional protections during war to argue for their removal during peacetime border enforcement." Johnson opened his mouth but said nothing. The confidence that carried him through earlier exchanges was gone. He glanced to his staff. None of them met his eyes. Crockett paused to let the contradiction sink in. "These aren't interpretive disagreements. These are factual errors," she said, "and they reveal something deeply troubling about how constitutional law is being used in this chamber." She took a breath, lowered the folder slightly, and let her voice grow sharper, not louder, just more exacting. "You wanted to educate me, Mr. Speaker, but I came here having read every case you cited, every precedent you leaned on, and I didn't read summaries. I read the opinions, the footnotes, the dissents." She held up the folder again. "This isn't a collection of talking points. It's the Constitution, and it deserves more than your political performance." Johnson stared blankly. The silence was suffocating, and Jasmine Crockett hadn't even reached her final argument yet. Crockett stepped closer to the podium. Not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate. Her voice had steadied into something even more dangerous than outrage. Control. "Let's move to Korematsu versus United States," she said, flipping to the next tab. Johnson winced. Everyone in the room knew that name. The case that upheld Japanese-American internment during World War II. A ruling that had been widely condemned in the decades since, even formally disavowed by the Supreme Court. "You cited Korematsu as precedent for emergency authority," she said. "But let's remember what that case actually represents. It was a failure of the judiciary, a betrayal of constitutional principles. The court upheld racial discrimination under the guise of national security. That decision was so discredited, the court itself later called it, and I quote, 'gravely wrong the day it was decided.'" She let the weight of those words land. "You used that case," she continued, "to argue that Congress should have sweeping authority to bypass civil liberties in emergencies. But Mr. Speaker, Korematsu is not a foundation for your argument. It's a warning against it." She took a long pause. The tension was thick. The only sounds in the chamber were the subtle clicks of press cameras and the scribbles of reporters trying to keep up. Johnson opened a binder in front of him, flipped a page, then closed it again. There was nothing in there that could save him now. "And that's what worries me most," Crockett said, her voice softening, but her words cutting deeper. "This isn't about left or right. This isn't even about immigration or border security. This is about a dangerous pattern in American politics, using the Constitution like a prop instead of treating it as a binding promise to the people." She held up another page from her folder. This one not from a casebook, but from Johnson's own legal writings. In 2013, Mr. Johnson wrote a legal brief arguing for limited federal authority and strict separation of powers. Yet today, he proposes an emergency powers bill that gives unilateral discretion to the executive branch. She raised an eyebrow. "Was your position wrong then, or is it wrong now?" Johnson leaned forward. "There are evolving interpretations," Crockett interrupted. "This isn't about evolving interpretation. This is about intellectual honesty. You once argued that emergency powers must be narrowly tailored. Today you argue they should override long-standing constitutional checks. Her eyes didn't waver. Which Mike Johnson are we supposed to believe? The one who lectured federal courts about executive restraint? Or the one standing here trying to rewrite the limits of power under the guise of crisis? The blow landed. Johnson visibly recoiled, eyes darting between colleagues, searching for even a nod of support. There were none. Crockett stepped back slightly, allowing the silence to linger. She wasn't performing. She was prosecuting. And she had the Speaker of the House cornered on live television, with his own words as evidence. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She closed the folder softly. The final pages, the knockout punches, had already been delivered. All that was left now was the question. The one no one expected. The one no politician wants to answer. She looked at Johnson squarely, her voice calm, unwavering. "Mr. Speaker," she said, "I've cited every case you mentioned. I've corrected the record. I've quoted your own legal writings from a decade ago. And with all due respect," she paused. A beat of silence. "Your argument doesn't stand. Not legally, not ethically, not historically." Johnson's face tightened. He sat forward, trying to appear composed, but the panic behind his eyes was unmistakable. His pen tapped twice against his binder, then stopped. Crockett stepped forward, her expression now devoid of any political theater. This wasn't about scoring points. This was about something far deeper. Integrity. "So now," she said, "I'm left with only one question." The room tensed. "Are you confused?" she began slowly. "Or are you deliberately misleading the American people about their Constitution?" Gasps echoed. Audible, visceral reactions from the press gallery and even some Republican aides. It wasn't just a rhetorical question. It was a direct accusation, and it struck with the precision of a legal scalpel. Johnson opened his mouth but said nothing. He blinked, swallowed, looked down at his notes, looked at his staff, looked anywhere but at Crockett. "You built your career on being the party's constitutional expert," she continued. "So either you don't understand the very cases you cite, or you're using them to push a political agenda you know is unconstitutional." Johnson tried again. "I think," he muttered, we should move on." "No, Mr. Speaker," Crockett replied firmly. "You asked to educate me. The American people deserve your answer. Which is it?" The silence was suffocating. The committee chair looked visibly shaken, unsure whether to gavel for order or let history write itself. Crockett remained perfectly still, arms at her sides, the full weight of the moment resting in her stillness. Johnson finally leaned back in his chair, defeated. "We'll need to confer with legal counsel on the specifics," he said. It was a lifeline thrown to himself, but no one was reaching to grab it. Crockett didn't speak again. She didn't need to. She returned to her seat, coolly sliding her folder closed. Behind her, reporters rushed to file updates. Staffers scrambled out of the hearing room. And Johnson, the once unquestioned constitutional authority of the Republican Party, sat motionless, staring straight ahead at nothing. It was over. In just under 20 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had flipped the script. She'd turned a hearing meant to advance Johnson's emergency powers bill into a constitutional reckoning, and walked away with something no freshman Congresswoman had ever taken so decisively from a sitting speaker: his credibility. The power dynamic in that chamber had shifted, permanently, and everyone in the country was about to witness it. By the time Jasmine Crockett closed her folder and stepped out of the hearing room, the political earthquake had already begun. Inside the Capitol, the silence still lingered like a fog, but outside, on Twitter, TikTok, and every news outlet in America, the explosion had detonated. Crockett Schools Johnson began trending within 20 minutes. 10 minutes later, it was the #1 hashtag in the country. Speaker silenced and Dasha constitutional clapback weren't far behind. The clip of Crockett's final question, "Are you confused or are you deliberately misleading the American people?" was shared over 5 million times in the first 3 hours. TikTok creators added dramatic music under Johnson's stunned silence. YouTube channels ran side-by-side comparisons of his confident opening and his flustered collapse. The edits were brutal and captivating. Harvard law professor Lawrence Tribe posted the clip with a simple caption: "A first-term Congresswoman just taught a masterclass in constitutional law." His tweet racked up 80,000 likes before the sun set. Other legal scholars quickly followed. Dozens of professors from Georgetown, Yale, and Columbia chimed in. Every citation was accurate, every rebuttal airtight. This is the kind of legal clarity I wish more of my students had. Even voices from the right couldn't ignore it. Former judge and Fox News legal analyst Andrew Napolitano said live on air, "Regardless of your politics, Crockett was precise. Johnson's arguments, not just weak, they were legally indefensible." Within 12 hours, clips of the hearing were being shown on CNN, MSNBC, and even Fox News. Each network framed it differently, but the headline remained the same: Speaker humiliated by legal rookie. In Washington, the ripple effects turned to shockwaves. Democratic leadership huddled that same evening. By morning, House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries had publicly praised Crockett's extraordinary clarity and command of constitutional law and appointed her to a key role on the House Judiciary Committee. She represents the kind of leadership we need: principled, prepared, and fearless. Inside the Republican camp, the mood was very different. Leaks from Republican aides poured into the press. One senior staffer was quoted anonymously saying, "If he's our legal voice, we're in trouble." Several aides described a tense, stunned silence inside Speaker Johnson's office in the hours after the hearing. By the following afternoon, members of the House Republican Conference held an informal meeting to discuss future messaging discipline on constitutional matters. Translation: Mike Johnson had embarrassed them, and they needed damage control. Fast. Behind closed doors, it was even more brutal. One Republican lawmaker reportedly asked, "How do we defend a constitutional argument when our guy can't even get the precedent right?" Others pushed to sideline Johnson from future legal debates entirely. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett's name became a household one. Cable news couldn't get enough. She appeared on Rachel Maddow, Jake Tapper, and even had an invitation to The View by the end of the week. Late-night comedians dedicated full segments to the confrontation. Trevor Noah's opening monologue mocked Johnson's stunned silence. He looked like a man who just realized Wikipedia isn't a substitute for law school. But it wasn't just entertainment. The moment sparked a real national conversation. Bar associations issued statements applauding Crockett's commitment to accuracy and constitutional clarity. Law schools began circulating clips of her questioning as part of their constitutional law syllabi. The American Constitution Society posted, "This is what it looks like when substance triumphs over sound bites." Donations to Crockett's re-election campaign spiked. In 24 hours, she raised over $800,000, the majority in small-dollar contributions from first-time donors. Her website crashed twice. Local. Radio in Texas dubbed her the Defender and Congress's legal eagle. Voters in her district flooded her office with thank you calls and handwritten notes. But perhaps the most stunning shift was cultural. Young law students, particularly women and people of color, posted videos of themselves watching the hearing, visibly emotional. "I've never seen someone who looks like me take down someone with that much power. She didn't just win, she taught him the law." Think tanks started inviting Crockett to speak. Legal panels, university lectures, national bar associations. What began as a single committee hearing had elevated her to the forefront of constitutional debate in America. And as for Johnson, he went silent for days. His press secretary canceled appearances. His legal advisory team issued a vague memo about ongoing review of constitutional interpretations. But the damage was irreversible. Mike Johnson, once seen as the constitutional compass of the GOP, had been publicly dismantled, not by a veteran opponent or elite scholar, but by a first-term Congresswoman who came prepared and refused to be dismissed. The fallout wasn't just about one man's embarrassment. It was about a cultural reset, about truth mattering again, about law, not just politics. And in a nation desperate for accountability, that hearing gave the public something rare. A moment when justice didn't just feel possible, it felt delivered. What happened inside that hearing room was never just about one emergency powers bill. It was never just about Mike Johnson. It was about something deeper, something more American. It was about whether the Constitution still holds meaning when pushed against the pressure of modern politics, whether truth, facts, and legal integrity can still rise above party spin. That day, Jasmine Crockett proved they can. She didn't just win an argument. She shattered the myth that experience alone equates to expertise. She showed the nation that preparation, precision, and respect for the rule of law still matter. While Johnson leaned on titles and reputation, Crockett leaned on research, doctrine, and the written word. The result wasn't just a debate gone wrong for the speaker. It was a turning point for how Americans see legal authority in politics. Law schools across the country now study her performance. Professors break down her citations, point by point. Her questioning has been added to classroom discussions and casebooks, alongside the very cases she cited. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because the clarity she delivered was so undeniable, so grounded in law, that it's now considered a teaching moment in itself. Polls conducted just days later revealed a startling consensus. A majority of Americans, across both parties, now believe every elected official should be required to pass a basic constitutional literacy exam before taking office. And honestly, after what we all witnessed, can you blame them? Jasmine Crockett's rise wasn't orchestrated by media consultants or passis. It was earned, through study, through courage, and through her ability to speak the language of justice when everyone else was shouting politics. In that moment, she didn't just elevate herself. She reminded the country of what leadership is supposed to look like. Meanwhile, Johnson's political brand, once wrapped in constitutional authority, collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Stripped of his leadership role on legal issues, quietly distanced by conservative think tanks, and remembered not for his speeches, but for his silence. In a time when noise often overpowers truth, Crockett proved that facts still have a fighting chance. So now we want to hear from you. Do you think elected officials should have to pass a basic constitutional exam before taking office? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and hit that subscribe button, because next time we're exposing another high-profile cover-up with the receipts to back it up. You won't want to miss it.